in the U.S. context, state governments, the 50 state governments regulate local governments. Primarily, only has a small role to play around some municipal bond regulation and some federal aid and the oversight of federal aid. But primarily it's state governments. And what this means is you have 50 different regulatory systems in place, each one quite different from the other. There are some common features to note, particularly debt issuance. The U.S. relies on essentially local governments mostly financing their own capital projects and so forth. This is where a lot of problems have existed in the past. So we have a lot of debt regulation because of problems from all the way back to the 19th century. There's a lot of budget and audit regulation around how you do a budget, when it's required, what kind of transparency you must give to the public, when audits are required, a lot of tax regulation, and then just transparency regulation in general. So you have literally in every state, dozens of regulatory mechanisms in place. The other thing to note is who oversees these regulations. In some states, there are state authorities who do regulate and do enforcement or compliance. And then in some states, it's up to the local governments and really the citizens, in essence, to regulate these things, and there's no state oversight. So the legislature may pass laws, but they won't enforce them at the state level. It's basically up to citizens or local government authorities themselves to do that. And then we have about 15 states that are actively doing fiscal monitoring, where they're actually using fiscal metrics of some kind, usually a portfolio of measures, to determine if there will be distress going forward and to see if something should be done about it. So that's just to give you that context. These things change occasionally. I should note during the pandemic that there was some relaxation of regulations to provide some assistance because of all the problems of local governments were facing in 2020, 2021. So some regulations were temporarily removed or limited, but now most of them have come back in place as the pandemic has ended. The other thing probably to note is in terms of fiscal distress, the pandemic resulted in the estimates are about $6 trillion was pumped into the US economy by the federal government and by the Federal Reserve Bank, and about 500 billion of that went directly to local governments. In contrast, in the Great Recession, very little money actually went directly to local governments. So there's a huge contrast in how these two crises were managed. Both the Trump and Biden administrations injected huge amounts of money directly to local governments, not going through the state governments at all. That was unprecedented in many ways at this scale. It is probably going to lead to some interesting challenges going forward over the next few years as local governments are trying to manage. Just to give you an example, in Flint, where I've worked for several years with the mayor, the Flint budget is probably 100 million a year, and the federal government gave Flint about $150 million, so really more than their entire budget. And as you can imagine, this can lead to some challenges spending that kind of money, and you really only have about 3 years to spend it. And so that may result in some unanticipated fiscal challenges as the time runs out. But again, we have some states actively monitoring a number of metrics to see. Also, I should know in the US, there's a big move right now to use artificial intelligence and machine learning to assess fiscal distress. I'm working with a group out of the Government Finance Officers Association, also Rutgers University, which has some set of supercomputers. So that's a big move. And one of the things that's interesting, I wanted to note that is because it's not just using financial measures, the typical stuff that we normally use, although that will happen as well. Keep in mind, the US has 90,000 local governments of all sizes, of all sophistication. Most of them are quite small, actually. So the audit data is there, although it does vary by state as to how good the data is and how often it's available. Um, but we're also going to be scraping data from newspapers to look for articles indicating fiscal distress, looking at even minutes of local government meetings, which are usually published in PDF form on a website. So there's a huge amount of data science going into this now to see how to assess fiscal distress using AI. And I think there'll be some advances in the technology over time. So putting aside the AI piece, which is still fairly experimental, our typical distress metrics of those who are monitoring distress actively, um, cash ratios, quick ratios, cash flow analysis. Um, One of the things I would note, because I was deputy state treasurer for the Michigan Department of Treasury for 2 years and oversaw these kinds of programs, is that cash flow is usually the first thing. If there's a fiscal distress situation, usually in the US, the first thing is going to be cash flow because that is generally not available to the state government regulators in any, real-time way. So generally the first thing that will be required would be a cash flow analysis to determine if there's going to be payment problems for vendors, bond payments, etc., employees immediately. So that's one of the first things that's typically done because otherwise the cash information is very dated. I mean, these audits are done usually 6 months after the fact. So, and it's essentially a point in time. So it's very inadequate for really cash solvency. There are cash ratios done, but they're generally pretty inadequate, quite frankly. Budget solvency would be things. I think it's important to note that all of these regulatory laws kind of come together to get a sense of distress and when intervention is needed. Because even if a government doesn't submit their audit on time, that's often an indicator of distress, for example. And a lot of states will use that as a metric. So not even using ratios per se, but just is information being given in a timely fashion as required by law. Um, Governments, most states are required to do a balanced budget. Some states actively look at budgets, some do not, in terms of how is the budget being balanced? Is there a lot of gimmicks or other one-time measures being used to balance the budget? Are there deficit financing measures? A lot of states, if you are required to do deficit financing of some kind, like issue some short-term tax, some governments will issue a note to pull the tax revenue forward to get it into this fiscal year, for example. That's usually an indicator of distress. Not always, sometimes there's good reasons to do that. But usually, if governments are issuing a lot of short-term debt, that's often something where there's going to be an indicator of distress. A lot of states heavily regulate short-term debt, and so they will require you to get approval from the state so they know what's happening, they know what you're doing, and they know why you're doing it. So often those are heavily regulated, any kind of less than 1 year debt kind of issuance. There is more move to long-term solvency measures looking at unfunded. The US is, and we would have to do an entire webinar to understand all this, honestly, but the US Social Security does not cover state and local government employees. So local governments are required to essentially offer pensions if they want to get anyone, if they want, I mean, they don't have to, but if they want to hire anybody, they generally have to offer this kind of thing of some kind, which means they build up these liabilities for this pension system, which is usually a long-term kind of assessed thing, infrastructure as well. And this is a big measure now with climate change becoming a major risk factor. Most infrastructure, at least in the US, was built for a certain engineering tolerance of weather. And as the weather extremes increase, sewer and water lines, roads, even lighting systems are coming under increasing stress. So a lot more money is going to have to go into these systems, or at least one-time money to fix them or make them more resilient. And so that's becoming a real issue. And the problem is we don't measure infrastructure well on the balance sheet. It's generally just a sort of cost of infrastructure that was put in 20 years ago. That doesn't really measure what's needed today. So there is more balance sheet focus, unlike, say, 5 or 10 years ago, even as to assessing long-term solvency. because there's a realization that the long term is becoming more short term in some cases. And the other thing we really look at is audit findings. We really rely on the auditing industry because most local governments today are being audited by private firms, whereas, in the past, the go state governments were doing the audits, but that's generally not the case anymore. So there's a real reliance on those auditing firms, and we know, there have been scandals in the past with the auditing firms. So there's also audit regulation at the state level of auditing firms. Most local governments are not getting the big five to do their audits. It's going to be smaller local firms. And so again, there's a lot of regulation around that, and there's a real focus on the findings of those audits and what those indicate, where problems might exist. And then also the so-called going concern disclosure, which is quite rare, but basically means the auditors do not believe the government is a viable entity. There's a lot of talk now about what that actually means and how you measure that, but that's also a focus today, nationally. So if for states that do have those fiscal metrics in place, and it's hard to, I mean, we don't have enough time to go through. There's many different ways people measure distress. There's entire papers written on this of how that's measured, but there's usually some combination of metrics, and they could include socioeconomic indicators like population, poverty, educational attainment. The problem with that stuff is how often that data is being updated at the local level may not be adequate to really doing a lot of real-time analysis. Usually those are very long-term indicators of a community. So, if there is an indication, so if a state has an official process, and Virginia just, for example, got an official process by law of, okay, we're going to identify fiscal distress, however we do it. Usually there's a couple approaches that will be used. And again, that may be using those metrics and ratios. That may just be using, you didn't turn your audit in on time or whatever, or you issued a lot of short-term debt. So there's lots of ways this can be identified. But if it is identified, there's like three main approaches. One is public notification and what I'll call public shaming. Like, we're just going to put out, you're in trouble. The state isn't going to intervene, but we're going to make notice that you're in trouble and your citizens better do something, or the bond community is going to target you for higher interest rates or whatever it may be. So there is just literally this approach of sort of public shaming that goes on. Because some states, you have to understand, I mean, as you can imagine, there's a lot of politics in this stuff. I mean, the minute you try and take over a local government, you're going to have legislators from that area, you're going to have business leaders, you're going to have others trying to intervene. And these bureaucrats who are often in charge of this process, they're going to be inundated with this kind of political pressure. So this is not a political free area. This is absolutely where politics comes in. It's not just a technical decision. I was very involved in this. It's a political decision. The state may not want to do it. They just don't want to have the pressure or issues dealing with this. So there's a lot of politics in this stuff. Approach two, is the state will come in, but only provide technical assistance, maybe provide new grants, maybe provide some kind of consulting expertise. I should have put in here, approach two would include issuing debt. So a lot of states, if they're like, you're in trouble, we're just going to issue more debt for you, and we'll do it through us, so it's cheaper and more, and because bondholders will know we're going to repay it if you can't. So that's something to, and so you'll see a lot of this basically giving you more debt, but that only works if there's an actual solution or if it's only a short-term problem. The problem is you issue a bunch of debt and then the problem doesn't get fixed. Now you got a bunch of debt with a government that still isn't doing well. And so that happens often where the state is like, we don't want to deal with this problem. We don't really want to have a lot of public notice, so we're just going to issue more debt to you. But if there's not a real solution, then often that backfires in the long term. But again, this is what I mean. Politics always enters this process of how we're going to deal with these things, because issuing debt is seen as a less politically problematic way to deal with the problem. And so you'll often see that where they try and do it very quietly without anyone really knowing what's going on, because the public isn't paying attention to this kind of stuff often. And newspapers and the media have been decimated by the internet, so we don't have very good local coverage anymore of local government in particular. So that's also something to note, where I think this would have been a bigger deal in the past. Finally, state takeovers do happen. They have happened in the past. They are pretty rare, to be quite frank. But that does happen, where the state literally takes over, and this can take many forms, whether it's a complete takeover or a partial takeover. Michigan was very famous for this. It was extremely politically controversial. Make no mistake about it, that was a huge amount of politics. During the Detroit takeover, there was even military potentially going out because of concerns of riots. That didn't happen, thankfully, but these things are very controversial often. There's really very little of that going on right now because I should probably preface it with saying, like, in a minute, I'll say, like, there's been a huge amount of money pushed into local government. So right now, local governments in general are pretty flush with money. But again, that may backfire in the long term. And again, bankruptcy is allowed in some states, but every state has to either allow it or actually, states have to allow bankruptcy. If they don't allow for it, it's basically not allowed at all. So Virginia does not allow bankruptcy, for example, whereas Michigan does. And that goes through a federal court if it does happen. But it's extremely rare, actually. Finally, last slide. The COVID-19 fiscal cliff is pretty much here as of 2024. It'll get worse in 2025. So all this means is, like I said, there was $500 billion sent to local governments over 3 years. That money starts to run out this year and next year. There's no clear signs. Are we facing a cliff? So what does that mean? It means governments took this money and then they built it into their long-term budget, right? They gave employees more raises or whatever. Well, the problem is, are they going to have the revenue to cover those costs in 2 or 3 years? And that's the issue that's coming forward now. We don't know for sure because honestly, there's no good way to track this. But that's one of the big concerns. We are seeing a few early warning signs, I would say. There was one school district in Michigan that got in fiscal distress, a very wealthy school district, Ann Arbor, which is where the University of Michigan is. They just had a huge deficit. They had to lay people off. But we don't know if this is going to be an issue or not. Everybody's thinking about it. To be honest with you, when COVID started, there was a lot of concern we were going to have a fiscal crisis because, business was shut down. There were no tax revenues coming in. And so even for state governments, that was a concern in 2020. But by the end of 2020, we realized the federal government had done unprecedented things and sent out huge amounts of money. So I am very cautious. I don't really know if there's going to be a fiscal cliff or not. I would there are some very specific, unique situations going on with specific types of governments. So in the US, we have lots of different types of local governments or special government authorities, we call them, besides like cities and state governments. And there's like a whole bunch of other things out there. And the one I'm working on right now, so mass transit has been hit very hard by the pandemic. Ridership is still down because people, especially white collar workers, are still at home in many cases, and that may be a long-term permanent trend. So here in Washington, D.C., the Washington Metro Authority, which is the subway system, is in big financial trouble right now. It has very high costs, and the ridership is down because the federal government is having a lot of people work remotely. But this system is very critical to the economy of DC, the economy of Virginia, and the economy of Maryland. The District of Columbia is a weird government, which we don't have time to talk about also. It's a sort of strange federal government slash local government. And this authority is a strange thing, and I'm learning about it. But this is where we're seeing a lot of mass transit authorities in trouble, bus authorities, other things. So this is where we are starting to see some financial distress. This authority is like a federal thing, but it's also like a strange state authority. So it's very hard to say what it is exactly. It still has good bond ratings despite its fiscal crisis because I think the assumption is the federal government will bail it out, even though they're not required to. But we'll see. So that's an example of something that is going on right now. And I think there's more of that around the country. So thank you. Appreciate it.